All right, everybody. This podcast will be focusing on the learning target number 4, which is the axial skeleton. And specifically for this one, we're going to be talking about the skull only. So at this time, you want to have your notes open and split screen with this podcast so you can follow along. Okay, as I said, we are going to be focusing on the bones of the skull and face for this podcast. All right, so I'm going to take you through some of the major bones of the skull and face on this slide. I'm just going to use my own color coding system, and I'll try to show you on both views. So if you want to try to follow along with me, I know we have different colors, but all right. So let's just start with the big bones that make up the skull. So we have the frontal bone. The frontal bone is this one right there. And on this view, it would be this one. So this is where your forehead would be. Remember, frontal meant forehead. And your frontal lobe would be directly behind there. Okay, the next bone of the skull is the parietal bone, which is this one right here. On the frontal view, you can kind of see it on the sides sticking out right there. Okay, next we have the occipital bone. Occipital bone is the one in the back of your head. Remember, in your torso terms, occipital meant the back of your head. You can actually not see it on this view, on the other view, because it's at the back. And your occipital lobe of your brain is right behind there. Okay, let me get a different color. Okay, the temporal, which is located, if you were just to like follow your ear kind of back to your skull, that's your temporal bone. And on the frontal view, you can see the temporal bone right there. Okay, all right, now on to the other bones that make up your facial structures. Let's do the sphenoid bone first. So the sphenoid bone, which you see right here, on this view, it's just kind of right behind like your eye sockets there. Okay, right next to your temporal bone, behind your cheekbone. On the frontal view, you can actually see it a little bit right here, and then it's actually the bone you see through your orbitals, your eye sockets. So you can see it back there too. So that's the sphenoid bone. Okay, let's pick a different color for your nasal bone. So the ethmoid bone, it's kind of tricky to see on most skulls, so we actually skip that one so you can cross out the ethmoid bone. The nasal bone, that is the bone that makes up the bridge of your nose. So I'm coloring it in purple on these two views. Okay, the rest of your nose is cartilage. Okay, the next bone is the lacrimal. If you want to write next to lacrimal tear duct, because that is where your tear duct is, it is this bone that I'm coloring in like that light teal color. And then on the frontal view, let me zoom in a little so you can see it. It's right there. That is your lacrimal. Okay. All right. Next we have your, running out of colors. Next we have your maxilla. I don't like that one. Let me get a different color. Okay, maybe this light purple. I'm just going to go with the blue. Okay. So here is your maxilla, which is your upper jawbone. Okay, so that's your maxilla. Okay, then we have your mandible, which is your lower jawbone there. So there's your mandible. In this image, it's right there. Okay, and then we have your zygomatic, which is your cheekbone. And that is this one that I'm coloring in yellow. And on this view, I'm going to color it over with yellow. That is your zygomatic bone. Okay, all right, those are the major bones of the skull. Now we're going to get into some finer details. All right, another feature of the skull that you should know is it's called the vomer. The vomer anchors the septum dividing your left and your right nostrils. So let's zoom in on that picture. You should see the vomer right there, dividing your left and your right nostril. So that is the vomer. Okay, the next special skull feature is called a sella turcica. And your sella turcica is a depression in that sphenoid bone, and that's where your pituitary gland sits. So if we look at that picture, you can see the pituitary gland just kind of resting in this little depression here. That's the sella turcica. And if we look here, you can see it's highlighted in green there. That's the sella turcica. So when you have to find these in class, you actually have to take off the top of the skull, which is really easy to do. And then you can see kind of that little depression here where the pituitary gland would sit. Okay, next we're going to be looking at the foramen magnum. When you guys check out a skull, just flip it over so you look at the bottom of it, and you'll see a large hole at the bottom. And that's actually what foramen magnum translates as, is large hole. That is in the occipital plate. So the occipital plate is what you see in yellow here, occipital. And it is a large hole in the occipital plate that allows the spinal cord to connect to the brain. So that's how the spinal cord gets to the brain, through the foramen magnum. Okay, also when you flip the skull over, on either side of the foramen magnum, you will see these little bumps on either side, and those are called occipital condyles. And a condyle is usually located where there's a joint, so a movable connection between two bones. And in this case, the occipital condyle is where your skull sits on your cervical vertebrae. So this is where your skull is sitting on that first neck vertebrae, and that's how what would allow you to nod your head up and down like you're saying yes, is that those occipital condyles. Okay, the next bone I wanted to talk about is the hyoid bone. Technically not part of your skull, but it's really the best time to mention this bone. This bone is pretty special because it doesn't articulate with any other bone. So in other words, it doesn't touch or form a joint with any other bone. It just kind of floats there. It is anchored to your temporal bone by ligaments, and it's about 2 centimeters above your larynx, which is your voice box. And this is what allows the tongue, it's the movable base for the tongue. So I'll show you on the next slide in the anatomy app what it looks like, the hyoid bone. But this is also an attachment for neck muscles that help to raise and lower the larynx when swallowing and speaking. Hyoid bone in the anatomy app. So here is a lateral view of the skull, and there is the hyoid bone just kind of floating there underneath the jaw. So it looks kind of silly when you see it like this, but if we add some connective tissue, so I'm just adding layers of connective tissue, so you can see right there it's connected to the tongue. I'm just going to keep adding some layers of connective tissue. Then you can see, let me zoom in a little. You can see there it's connected by these very, very thin ligaments up to the temporal bone. And then if I add, let's see if I could add some muscles in there, you can start to see how it's connected to some of the neck muscles, and then, and then the tongue. So there's a little bit about that crazy hyoid bone that just appears when you take all the connective tissue and muscle away, to be just kind of floating out there. Okay, and the last thing we're going to talk about with the skull is how an adult skull compares to a fetal skull, so a baby skull. So fetal faces are much smaller compared to the size of the head than adults. So that means their facial features take up much less percentage of their actual head size than adult faces do.
Fetal skulls have a much higher percentage of body length compared to the adult. So when you look at a baby, notice next time how big their head is compared to the size of their body. Okay, so our heads take up a significantly less percentage size-wise to our whole body than babies do. Fetal faces are much flatter than adults. So especially if you look at the lateral picture right here, their cheekbones aren't prominent, their nose, their jaw, they're not prominent. That's something that happens during puberty when the facial structure, facial bones start to really define themselves and come out. That's why babies have cute little soft chubby faces. It's just because their facial bones are much flatter underneath. Um, Fetal faces have less volume of facial bones than the adult skull. It's kind of the same concept we just talked about. And then probably the most noticeable thing is that fetal skulls have fontanelles. Fontanelles are regions that are not yet covered by bone. We probably would more commonly call these soft spots if you've ever been around a baby. And you can see some here. This is the biggest one on the top of the baby's head. If you've ever, but there's other smaller ones too that you can see there. If you've ever, and some on the side too. If you've ever been around a baby, you have to be really careful with the top of their head because that big anterior fontanelle, that soft spot, it's covered by fibrous tissue but not bone. So it's very fragile. And even if you're around a baby with no hair, sometimes you can even see it. That anterior one on the top, like a little depression in the top of their head. So you have to be really careful with that. So that allows flexibility during birth and for brain growth. It allows them to accommodate the growth of their brain and also being pushed through the birth canal. If you've ever seen a newborn that has just been born, sometimes their heads can take kind of a funny cone shape for a little while, and that is just because those bones have been squeezed, and it's okay because the fontanelles allow that to happen. And I believe that anterior fontanelle on the top of your head does not actually fully suture together until you're in your 20s. So you guys technically still have a little mini soft spot on the top of your head.
A little tour of the skull on a slightly more three-dimensional level. So let's start with the bones of the skull. Here is the frontal bone highlighted in green. You can see it from the front and the side. Okay, next let's look at the parietal bone. There it is from the front. Barely see it. Here is the temporal bone. Okay, and then in the back you see that occipital bone. Okay, now for the bones of the face. First, let's look at the sphenoid bone. So I clicked on the sphenoid bone here, and I'm just going to rotate the skull around and see how you can see it through the orbits, the eye sockets. Okay, here's the nasal bone. Okay, oops, I zoomed in a little too much. There we go. There's a nasal bone. Here is that lacrimal that we talked about, the tear duct. Okay, your cheekbone, your zygomatic, your maxilla, which is the upper jaw, and the mandible, which is the lower jaw. And I'm going to rotate it around. Let's see if I can get there's your vomer highlighted there. See, let me rotate it. There's the vomer. And if I rotate the skull, so you can see the bottom. Sorry, my computer doesn't love screen recording with the anatomy app at the same time. It's very angry. Here we go. So I can't highlight this, but here's the occipital plate, and see the hole? That's the foramen magnum. So that's how the spinal cord would get to the brain. And then on either side of the foramen magnum, we have the occipital condyles. So this is where the skull would sit on your first neck vertebrae. Okay, so I think I have showed you everything. The only thing I didn't show you is the sella turcica,
Let's see if I could do that really quick. I have to hide these bones. Okay, so I'm now looking into the skull, and I'm going to highlight the sphenoid bone. It's kind of bat-shaped. And then right here, the area I'm circling, that is the sella turcica. That's where the pituitary gland would rest. Okay, hope that helped. All right, there are 2 great sets of Quizlets to practice the skull. Keep watching this video because I am going to go through the labs you're going to be doing in class today, so please don't stop watching. But I wanted to point these out. So these are both linked in Schoology, or you can click the link in your notes. But there's one from the anterior view and the lateral view. Both are really great to practice, and they come with diagrams. So make sure you check those out for a little extra practice today. Also, I just noticed the directions on this slide are from last year. It says week 10 folder. You would just find these in your unit 3 folder. Okay, so to review the skull today in class, you're going to practice labeling the skull. So if you look at your lab tables, you should see a skull at each lab table. And then you should also see rolls of masking tape and then Sharpies. And what you're going to do is you're going to take the skull with your lab partners and you're going to create little pieces of masking tape, maybe about 1 inch long, and you're going to put numbers on them. So you'll need 15 pieces of tape numbered 1 to 15, and each number is going to represent a different part of the skull. And I want you to practice with your teammates at your lab table labeling the skull. And try to spread the work out a little bit. There's 15 labels. So if each of you take, 4 labels approximately, if each of you take approximately 3 to 4 labels, you can kind of take turns labeling the skull. But just practicing with a real skull in front of you, and then you'll take a picture and you'll place the picture. So this is called Skull Labeling Review, and you can find that in the Unit 3 folder. So you'll do that first, and then when you're done doing that, you'll sit back down and work on your lab, which I'll describe on the next page. On the next page of your lab. Okay, when you are done practicing labeling the skull in real life on the lab table, you're going to work on your lab. Please keep in mind we are skipping to part 4. Okay, so make sure you scroll down to part 4. We'll come back to part 2 and 3. And for this one, you're going to color code the skull. So each bone you want to pick a different color for, and just color in the little circle for each one. And then once you shade it in, for this, sometimes a highlighter is nice if you can do that, or you can just outline the bone, or if you want to give it like a little shade. But again, a highlighter and notability will work too, because then what you're going to do is you're going to take a side profile picture of yourself, or if you're not comfortable with that, just go find a side picture profile of somebody on Google and put the side picture, profile picture here from the side, and then you're going to, in Notability, use your scissors tool and copy and paste those colors on a real face. You can see the skull bones transposed on your face or whoever's face you decide to use. And you'll do the same thing for the frontal view. You'll color in all those bones and then transpose those colors on an actual face. Okay, I hope this helps. I hope you have fun reviewing the skull today, and email me with questions.